So, our first speaker is Emily Lane, and I'll invite Emily to come to the stage. Dr. Emily Lane is a natural hazards modeller with a specific focus on inundation due to fluvial and pluvial flooding, tsunamis and storm surge. She is leading an Endeavour program to increase Aotearoa's resilience to flooding. She has been working at NIWA since 2006 and is the program leader of their Resilience to Hazards program. Welcome, Emily, and I'll hand over to you to share your knowledge with us.
Tēnā koutou katoa. E rere hare ana ki te mana whenua o te rohi nei ki Ngāti Whātua o Raki me ngā hapu me ngā iwi o Tāmaki Makaurau. Tēnā koutou mōtou koutou manaakitanga i tēnei wā. Ko ōrongo mai te maunga e ru nei tako ngā kau, ko opa waho te awa e mahia nei aku māharahara. No Tāmaki Makaurau hou, engari e noho ana ki Aotearoa nei. Hei kaipatai o hou ki Tāhoro Nukurangi, ko Emily Lane toko ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I'm here today to talk about Aotearoa flooding and climate change, so working to increase flood resilience in changing times. And I'll just sort of quickly go through this, and I might start with a little bit of a sort of setting the scene by looking at some floods. And flooding is New Zealand's most common natural hazard, and it's also our most expensive one. So in 2020, the Insurance Council of New Zealand said that it was actually sort of our most expensive year ever. There were over $250 million worth of claims that were made on weather-related hazards, and over 160 million of them were in flooding. Then the next year, 2021, there were actually over $300 million in weather-related and over 250 in flooding alone. And this year, just counting up to sort of July, they're already over $230 million in weather-related hazards and over 100 million in flooding. And I mean, that's not even including sort of the Nelson floods. And as if you've been looking at the pictures, you'll see flooding happens all over New Zealand. It's not isolated to any one place, and it affects people a lot. But one of the things I'm really keen to talk about today is climate change. So the climate is changing. We've already increased the Earth's temperature 1 degree since pre-industrial times. And we're keeping on doing it. Even if we stopped emissions today, there's a lot more in temperature increase that's baked in. And so warmer air can carry more moisture. And so as the temperature increases, short, intense rainfall events will become more frequent and spikier, so more concentrated in their spatial extent. So you'll get these downpours. Now this is especially problematic in urban areas. So this is the Hawke's Bay, but I could have shown you pictures of Kumeu, I could have shown you pictures of New Plymouth. It happens in all of our urban areas. This is a real risk. And also sea level rise, it exacerbates flooding. Even in places where you don't get that flooding from the sea, it can exacerbate the freshwater flooding by reducing the drainage and increasing groundwater levels. And so this is sort of South Dunedin, which is probably unfortunately one of the poster childs of this sort of flooding. So we need to understand how these changes affect our flood hazard. And climate change, predominantly it's sort of warmer. There's sort of a lot of people talking about a lot of places will become drier. And even in places where droughts are increasing, climate change is a problem. So this was Canterbury towards the end of May last year. And then 2 days later, this was what it was like. So Canterbury had been in drought conditions for all of the first half of 2021. And then we had this. So this was, in some places, they had a 1 in 200 year 48-hour rainfall total. So even in places where the amount of rainfall overall is staying the same or even going down, you can still get flooding. So this is why it's really important for us to understand this. I couldn't talk about flooding without talking about Westport, and you'll see this place a lot. But so this was what happened in July 2021. The town was a lot of it was inundated. And this isn't actually the worst flood. I mean, even before climate change, we had floods. And in 1927, there was a flood that was probably a 1 in 80-year event. The current, the one that happened in 2021, they sort of think maybe a 1 in 60-year. But I mean, these sort of things are somewhat meaningless though in a changing climate, because it's becoming more and more frequent. And this is a horrible graph. It was not done by me, but some colleagues. But the take home from this graph, because I don't even understand it myself, but they were looking at all sorts of different models of our climate. And they basically sort of looked at all these models and they said all of the models say that this particular event that happened has become 1 to 2 times more likely, possibly even 4 times more likely because of climate change. So this event that happened is more likely, it's happening more often because of climate change. The other way you can think about it is that the same event, it's a bigger event that happens. And so, you look over all of these models and it's between 0 and 10% bigger in sort of the majority of the models, and some of them are actually saying it's 20% bigger because of climate change. And so, that was in July last year. February 2022, it almost happened again. In August, it almost happened again. In fact, Westport dodged this bullet, but it just went slightly further north, and this was the rainfall event that caused all the flooding in Whakatu in Nelson. So, these events are happening, they're happening more and more frequently. And it's not just the climate that we're changing that can affect flooding. There are other ways that we can change our flooding hazard, and I thought I'd chuck these in because you're all landscape architects, so if you don't remember anything else of my talk, if you remember this. So impervious surfaces. So if you've got surfaces that the water just runs off and it can't soak in, you're making flood hazard worse. You're getting all that water, it's being transferred across the surface, it's not soaking in, it's not, you're transferring all of the sort of the potential sort of pollutants that are on that, those surfaces, and they're going straight into the drains, they're going down. Whereas if you've got pervious surfaces, so places where it can soak in, it can evaporate away, they can filtrate what's going on. So these are ways that we can actually, change our flood hazard by ensuring that we're keeping these pervious surfaces. Also, wetlands and natural sponges. So this is pretty much the view from my house. I live in Aotearoa, as I said. And so this is somewhere where they've actually restored a wetland. And they've done a lot of work sort of on the west side of Christchurch. And I mean, it's not the full solution, it's not completely eliminating floods, but you're just sort of allowing that sponge to take up a lot of water. And the flooding that we had sort of last year would have been far worse if it hadn't been for this sort of work. Another thing to sort of actually understand is where the water flows. So overland flow paths, so when you do actually start getting that water flowing, it naturally, water flows down. And in places like Auckland, they've actually mapped all of them. Even in places where they haven't, water flows down, it flows into the gullies. And if we block those, we're going to make flooding worse, because the water's going to, you're basically saying, hello flood, come to me. So, these are things that to remember. But sort of taking that big picture again, insurance. So it's a big thing for you. I've already talked about all the money that insurance pays out on flooding, and they're paying attention to that. They are actually there to make money. They're not just there to pay out money to us if our place gets flooded. And so tower insurance is actually moving to risk-based premium for flooding. So they're basically saying you're low, medium, high risk of flooding, and if you're high risk of flooding, you have to pay out more money. And that's because sort of in the 18 months between mid-2020 to the end of 2021, they alone paid out $300 million in flood-related claims. And Aotearoa is the second highest in the world, ranked by Lloyd's of London for natural disaster losses. And so this sort of brings on to insurance retreat. And so this is work by Belinda Story, and mainly she's been looking so far into the coastal areas, and so retreat caused by sea level, but you're going to get exactly, we're already seeing exactly the same thing in terms of flooding. So as these flood events become more and more common, first you get partial retreat, and that's what we're already seeing. That's where you're actually having to pay more if you're in an area that is a higher flood risk. Or perhaps there's more conditions on your insurance, or perhaps you might have to specify that. And then as it gets more and more frequent, when you start to get places where you're getting flooding 1 in 25, 1 in 20 years, that's where you get full retreat. So basically insurance says, I'm not going to insure this place anymore. Or at least, I'm not going to insure it for flooding. You cannot get insurance. And sort of think again about Westport. It's like, when's this going to happen? So just sort of, looking again, another sort of step back at sort of the governance level, because flooding's quite interesting in New Zealand because it's sort of spread right throughout all of governance in terms of who looks after what. And so at that central level, they actually set the legislation, and there's an awful lot of different sort of acts that control flooding. So the RMA, Civil Defence Emergency Management, Building Act, Soil Conservation and Rivers Control Act. And then different ministries are involved. Ministry for the Environment is guidance, NEMA, the National Emergency Management Agency, actually, when there is an emergency and directly after it. MPI looks after rural flooding. And then at the regional level, they're the ones that actually manage the rivers and the catchments. They own and operate any flood defences that there are, and it's the regional councils that actually get to issue a flood warning if they think there is a flood coming. And then at the local level, that's where they control the building and effective land use. So I mean, I know that some of you landscape architects are probably in local government, and you might deal with this. They provide flood information via hazard registers or the district plan, and they coordinate with emergency services, if a flood actually happens. So they're there, when the rubber hits the road. And there's been an awful lot of sort of work on flooding in the last little while, but back in 2008, the Ministry of Environment basically said the current level of information about flood risk across New Zealand, we just don't have that information, And so, at the time they said we need a broad-scale analysis using a consistent set of parameters just to understand, what is our flood hazard, what is our flood risk, and how is that going to change under climate change. And so until 2020, they still didn't have anything. Unfortunately, at that point, they gave me money to find the answer. And so I'm a little bit scared because I've got 5 years to do it. But there's also been a lot of other things that have happened. So preparing for future flooding, there's sort of, some of the climate change projections and adaptations, recommendations, the national disaster strategy, there's some coordination about flood infrastructure. This is the Climate Change Adaptation Act, and we're in a place where we've got a housing crisis. So this is another thing. It's not specifically flooding, but it's feeding into it. You've got people suggesting things like the Hamilton-Auckland corridor. Oh, but was that a subliminal message there? You've got shovel-ready projects. I mean, so COVID happened, and they were trying to sort of get things back, and so there's actually been $210 million given to fix flood defences, and sort of, because a lot of these flood defences, no one's done anything since the 1980s when the regional council was given it. They've already sort of spent half of this, and they're looking for more money to sort of keep on sort of, keeping this sort of up to date. There's also things like green infrastructure, and in many ways, these sort of solutions can be a lot better than those hard structures. We've got the Resource Management Act reforms. There's climate-related disclosures and other matters. There's taumata Aotearoa. There's a lot of things going on. And just sort of going back to a couple of those ones, so the National Climate Change Risk Assessment and Adaptation Plan. And so this has to happen every 6 years. Every 6 years we take stock of, what are the risks to New Zealand under climate change? The first version came out in 2020, and it basically didn't have any flooding information because there wasn't any. So from that, there's also the National Adaptation Plan, and this has to come out again every 6 years, 2 years after the risk assessment, and it's basically responding to that risk assessment. So it's developed by government together with local government, iwi, Māori and others. And so, I mean, it's great what they're planning to do. They want to enable better risk-informed decisions, drive climate-resilient developments in the right locations, and have adaptation options, including managed retreat. These are all very good things, but the devil is always in the details about how this actually, is achieved. The other thing, and I mean many of you probably know more about this than me, but is the RMA reform. So there's the Natural and Built Environment Act, there's the Strategic Planning Act and the Climate Adaptation Act. And so under this you're going to have national planning frameworks and also sort of taking a regional view, so regional spatial strategies to try and sort of, look at this as a regional level. And I think as a general thing, again, this is a really great way. We can't just look at these as individual places. We need to look at this in regional lenses and actually sort of look at these strategies. But the devil is still in the details about how this is done. And all of this requires good data. So if we don't have good data, we can't make good decisions. And so what do we actually know about flooding in New Zealand? So if you look sort of at that picture of where you see all of Aotearoa, that was done a couple of years ago by one of my colleagues, and at the time that was what was known about flood hazard locations in Aotearoa. Now if you look at the west coast of Te Waipanamu, it looks like there's not very much flooding. I'll give you a secret, there's a lot of flooding. Remember Waiho, remember Westport again, but this was what was available. And so in different places, you've got different things. Up in Auckland, Auckland Council, they're very well funded, and so they've done amazing work at sort of mapping out their floodplains and their overland flow paths. In other places, like around Wellington, they've mapped out the floods from the major sort of catchments, but not everywhere. And then in other places, like in Southland, they might have, there were some floods in Southland a while back, and so they've got, this is where the flood was, and so that's their flood hazard is, well, that's where it flooded before, so that's where it flooded again. And I mean, that's a good start, it's not wrong. There are also some international sort of, flood hazard of the world maps, but a lot of them are just sort of not that great. I mean, if you look at, you've got sort of, Point Chev there and sort of out there in the Waitemata Harbour, and it says, pretty much as far as I can tell, it says, if you're in the water, you might get wet. So basically, current flood hazard data has no consistency in terms of whether or not flood modelling is done, the annual exceedance probability, so that's how often it happens, resolution, methodology, climate change. Or there are some places where they've done a good job, but it's actually behind a paywall. So this is where, as I said, they gave me some money. So what my one is, I'm leading a program called Mā Te Haumaru o Ngā Puna Wai o Rākai Hautu, Ka Ora Noa Ke Tonu. And we call it Mā Te Haumaru o Te Wai for short. But basically this is a 5-year MB-funded Endeavour Resilience program to increase flood resilience in Aotearoa. And so a large part of it is producing updatable, nationally consistent flood inundation hazard and risk assessments for current conditions and future scenarios under climate change. And sort of creating a forum so that all of the interested parties can actually work together and ensure we can use this information to get the desired outcomes. And so there's a lot of reasons why, but a lot of it's sort of that national screening tool. Because in places like Auckland where they've already done the flooding, they've done it at a higher level because they're focusing on their area. But this is ensuring that places that don't have that flooding information, that we have information for them, so we can make decisions across all of Aotearoa that are fair, because we're not just saying, oh, well, there's lots of flooding in Auckland because they've mapped it. So we can identify where these hazards and risks are high and where they might change under climate change, and sort of use this information to work together with all of the interested parties to build a more resilient Aotearoa. And so this is the research aims as sort of Endeavour speak. You sort of have to phrase it the way they do, but it's basically sort of work plans or part of it. But the first part of it, Research Aim 1, is the National Flood Hazard Mapping. And so you can think about this as where gets wet. So that's the first thing we need to understand, is we need to understand where gets wet. Then the second research aim is the flood risk to the built environment. So you can think of this as what gets wet. So you start as where, you look at what. And then the third research aim is societal vulnerability to cascading hazards. So this is who gets wet and what the repercussions of that is. And then the third research aim is pretty much pulling it all together and so what? What do we do now? How do we take this information? And then you'll see you've got a couple of themes on the side, and they're not on the side because I'm sidelining them. The intent is to sort of that these flow all the way through. And so one of them is the Mātauranga Māori theme. So we want to sort of recognise and have Mātauranga Māori along with Mātauranga Pākehā to sort of understand and make these decisions. And there's also an uncertainty theme. So I'll start with the where gets wet. And it's not just about producing a map. A big part of this is creating a semi-automated system and methodology for nationally consistent flood maps. So we're not just doing this once and walking away. If at the end of 5 years I say, here's the maps, and I leave, I will have failed. The intent is to make a system so that we can take the best data that we have at the time, because we're still getting more. We don't even have LiDAR, so we don't understand actually what the topography of all the places around New Zealand is, and we can't do good flood mapping without that. So bringing that with the information about rainfall and our best knowledge about how flooding works, and bringing this together to make flood maps. And so, hey presto, instant flood, just add water. Unfortunately, it's not quite that easy. But yeah, so at the moment we're sort of working on some case studies, just perfecting it, and then we're sort of rolling it out to all of New Zealand. But Waikanae is one of the places that we're working on. So this is sort of a couple of floods. We've got one under the current climate, and so this is a 1% AEP, so you sort of expect it once every 100 years if the climate wasn't changing. And so what you're sort of seeing there is that's the time over 12 hours, so the rainfall sort of intensifies and then it dies off, and it's sort of where it falls, so mostly falls up in the hill areas. But so on the left-hand side, this is what you get under the current day climate, so that's the flooding that you would expect from a 1 in 100 year flood. And then on the right-hand side, if we add 2 degrees of warming, that's what we would add to it. So in some places we're adding like 2 metres worth of flood depth from 2 degrees of warming. So another place, I've talked about Westport a lot, and so we're looking at Westport, and so you can actually see this is the July event actually unfolding. You see the tide going in and out. You can sort of see the water coming down the Bulla River, the Kawatiri. It's just gone out on an oxbow, and then it sort of goes on. There's this overland flow path that takes it out to the Orowaiti estuary, and the water just sort of keeps on coming up and coming up. And one of the really scary things about Westport is at this point, the water, you can see it's just joined at the top. Westport is now an island, okay? So that means that anyone that's still in Westport is cut off from water all around it. And if the water then keeps on rising, that's a really unsafe place to be. They were lucky in July 2021 that it didn't. And so that, what you see on the left-hand side, that's actually from our measurements of, we went out and we measured how deep the flood water was in all those locations. And so, they were lucky. That's what lucky looks like in this situation, because if the water had kept on going, it could have been a lot worse. So the second research aim is the flood risk to the built environment. And so this is the what gets wet. And specifically we're looking at buildings, we're looking at land use, so sort of understanding the different, how much forestry land, how much farmland, how much urban land gets wet, and also sort of infrastructure networks. And so we're using Riskscape as a tool for actually understanding that flood risk. And think of networks, a very interesting one, because you think of roads, you think of bridges, you think of they've got the railway there too, and the rangatata, and infrastructure networks. If you take out part of that, you can actually have impacts far beyond the places that get wet. So when the Waiho Bridge was taken out, that had huge impacts up and down the west coast of New Zealand, even in these places that never got wet. And the same with the rangatata, that's State Highway 1 and the main trunk line. So then the third part of this is the who gets wet. And so with this we're looking sort of societal vulnerability to cascading events. And I'll just do a quick walkthrough of what a cascading event is. So say you have an extreme rainfall, maybe higher than normal tide, you've got the rain there. And so what you might get is the stop banks might get overtopped, so you get some flooding. And so that's going to impact road networks, water and power, all of this sort of infrastructure. And that's the first thing that it impacts, but the most important thing that it impacts is the people, those communities. Their lives are disrupted, sometimes for years at a time. And they have to sort of live in the clean-up from this and the knowledge that it might happen again. And so, they might sort of say, okay, we actually want to sort of upgrade, we want to build higher stop banks or sort of things like this. And I mean, again, this is what we're seeing playing out in Westport, as we speak. And so maybe they build higher stop banks, but the next time, perhaps that flood is a little bit higher and the same thing happens. So you can get this sort of being stuck in this vicious cycle, but it might be that they sort of say, oh, no, this isn't working, this is the nth time that it's happened. And so maybe a new system emerges. They take adaptation action. They decide, managed retreat. We're going to build back, but not in the same place. So these are all known cascades. But actually understanding, how these communities react, we don't know very much about this. And so, we don't fully know, what this means for people's lives and, what that strength of pressure to upgrade and how we might live with floods. And so what we're doing, we've got 3 in-depth case studies. We're not looking at Westport because it's just too raw in Westport. We don't want to cause more trauma by coming in there as sort of scientists and going, so what do you think of flooding? We're working in Aotearoa, Waikanae and Auckland, and we're basically sort of gathering stories of impacts. These are places where it has flooded in the past, where flooding has happened several times. So understanding what the financial, the cultural, the social impacts are, who experiences them, and how they cascade across the sector, what exacerbates them, what sort of thresholds are there or tipping points. And with climate change and when these events are increasing in magnitude and frequency, how does that change? And sort of using that so that we can understand what does this mean for how societies cope with risk and adaptation. So then the fourth part of it is the bringing it all together, because maps and information aren't always enough. So this was sort of in Hamilton in 2012. They put out lots of letters about what their flood hazard was, and all they got was angry responses from people saying you can't possibly do this. You're putting us on my limb. You're reducing my property value, and it just turned into sort of a nightmare. And this has happened in many times with sort of coastal inundation zones and all sorts of things. It's led to lots of work being retracted and all things. So it's caused a lot of heartache. And there's going to be heartache. We're living in a hard time. There are some hard decisions that are going to need to be made. Managed retreat, isn't going to be pretty, but it could be even worse if we don't do it in a good way. And so a large part of RA4 is what we call te whāriki o te wai. So te whāriki, it's a mat, and we're using this mat and we're bringing together all of the interested parties, the researchers, iwi hapu, central, local, regional government, the banks, the insurers, the communities, to understand about flooding, to talk through what the options are and to try and sort of get through this the best we can. And another thing, we talked about the climate crisis, and I mean, we've got sort of the national policy statement on urban density, and so there's 3 dwellings, 3 stories. So how will this play out? That's the sort of thing that you might see. And in Christchurch just recently, they've decided that they are not going to sort of ratify this, even though it's already sort of been done in Auckland and Wellington. And more development, I talked before about impervious surfaces. It could be a nightmare if it's done badly. And I mean, this new legislation allows for 60% impervious surface, so 15% sort of the home and 10% pavement. And so Auckland's central city at the moment is already only 50% impervious surfaces, just to sort of give you an idea of things. Auckland rainfall projections, the total amount is similar, but those extreme, sort of events, we expect them to be more likely. We've also got the 3 waters reform, and that sort of, the details are still being hashed out, but that involves the stormwater assets. And so we need to be able to sort of look at this at sort of a big picture and sort of come up with some strategies about doing density well. Mātauranga Māori. So Māori have deep spiritual connections with the land and the rivers, and they have different conceptions of risk, because risk is about the taonga, what is treasured by you, what's special to you, because that's, when that is affected, that's risk. And so also, if we get it right for Māori, we'll get it right for everyone. And specifically, we're working with the hapu o Wairewa Runanga, and we're helping them develop their climate change plan as it goes with flooding. There's also uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty in this in terms of the mapping, in terms of the flood risk, and also in terms of how we actually communicate that. And if we use it carefully, we can actually make better decisions because we understand that uncertainty. Then the elephant in the room, or outside, sea level rise. So our work's including the influence of sea level rise on freshwater flooding, but we're not looking at coastal flooding directly. There's actually quite a lot of research that is looking at these sort of issues, and so we're keen to ensure that our outputs are complementary and we can fit them together with theirs. And in the long term, as I said, I want this to be ongoing. These national climate change risk assessments have to happen every 6 years. So ideally, we're improving it all the time, and we're outputting that information in time for that risk assessment. But yeah, thank you very much, and I don't think I'm misleading advertising. There isn't any time for questions, but come and talk with me afterwards if you've got any.